Anyway, so I'm here basically to talk about, I am not an archivist, so what the hell do I do now? I didn't put that in the piece that I sent to you, but that's the way I feel. On the 15th of July 2015, Ireland passed the acclaimed Gender Recognition Act based on self-determination, a woohoo for us, and a pain in the neck for anti-trans people over here. Ireland at that point was only the 4th country in the world to do so. It is now one of 20. As a lead negotiator in that campaign, I experienced the full extent of what it takes to achieve such a momentous moment in trans people's lives. I appeared on TV, radio, partook in debates, wrote and delivered speeches, assisted in writing the myriad of documents that we produced, and created ephemera and starred in video output. I'm still waiting for my Oscar for that stuff, but anyway. However, in 2016, after the success and during the collective sigh of relief, a conversation between myself and my colleague Broden Giambrone regarding the recording, collection and archiving of the campaign actually really spoke to me. I commented to Broden at the time that I had this huge collection of trans memories spanning over 35 years. I'd been collecting trans stories, media, ephemera, or any shred of evidence that we existed, and more importantly, that there were others like me in the world since the early 1970s, since I was in my teenage years. A personal quest that spoke to me, obviously, to my survival. And that's all it was. It was purely my survival. It was about finding people like me. I was looking for my tribe. At the time, Broden then insisted to give me more work, that I should create an archive. It sounded like a great idea, but there was no consideration or no conversation regarding the resources needed to create it, to sustain it, who would work on it, how would we finance it. It was just, Sarah's going to do this. TENI, the national trans organisation, Transgender Equality Network Ireland, agreed to donate their archive, which had been at that point about 10 years in existence. I could speak to Dr. Lydia Foy, who was the leading campaigner through the legal process around gender recognition, and Louise Hannon for their legal stories and their archives, and maybe ask them to donate it. And in fact, I was perfectly placed to seek out other central individuals or other areas of sources of information that may actually be considered to be put in the archive, having been out for over 25 years at that point and being central to the community across every aspect of it for those 25 years. But then I'm not an archivist. I'm an activist, collector. If anyone wants to come and see my music collection, it fills a room about this size. A community historian, definitely, but probably more than anything, a storyteller. That's what I enjoy. I love finding out stories and I love telling them. I had no concept of how to create an archive, and also, clearly from my comment earlier, I'm not an academic either. My work is based in the community and based in activism. I set out to create a community archive, but not even knowing what that meant, I Googled it. Yeah, and you can imagine what I found. The closest thing that I could find was telling me that community archives are created to add and preserve marginalized voices that have been excluded from the historical record. And that was a perfect description of actually what I was trying to do. I started with my own collection, gathered books, ephemera, t-shirts, badges, leaflets, documents from my own home. Then I started to document the gender recognition campaign, write about our experiences, our strategies, our failures, our successes, and the stories, more importantly, like ringing on a Thursday afternoon all 166 members of Parliament, meeting 89 of them in the space of 3 days, and sending people all over the country, and getting 27 of them cross-party, including government, to stand up and say, this is not good enough, give them what they want, which is where we got gender recognition. But those are the stories that I wanted to tell. Those are the stories I wanted to document, but those are the stories that I wanted to archive. I also want to research what else was out there. What other stories had happened, what other trans people predated me looking for my tribe, predated the internet, because obviously you can find quite a lot of information within that space. Where were the trans people in our history? Because we all know that we've been here for centuries, but where is the evidence? And specifically from an Irish context, that was what I was trying to do. And let's be clear, I followed Alice down the rabbit hole. I found them. People like Albert Cashier, Edward Lacey Evans, James Barry, John Murphy, Marianne Weldon, Patrick McCormick, John Coulter, Carlette Gibbons, Margaret King, all just in the 19th century and all Irish. In fact, I found so many Irish people in the 19th century, I wonder if there was any other trans people actually existed back then, or else we just seem to be the ones getting caught out and ending up in the newspapers or being written about. And there were places that I could find some of this information, whether it was doing the normal digging that we all do in research by going through the library, go through some of the other records, reading medical records, all of that, or looking at existing archives, such as the Digital Trans Archive or the Transgender Archive, which came out of Coleraine University, which had been started by Dr. Richard Eakins many years ago. And there were some amazing resources. And I suppose as well, trawling through the newspapers. This is all personal time. This was all time that I didn't have, as you can see from some of the things that Irene mentioned about what I do. I also have a full-time job in the construction industry, just to clarify that. However, as I moved along, the people I mentioned earlier, Louise Hannon, Dr. Lydia Foy, all donated their archives. Now I was had a problem. In fact, Dr. Foy showed me a shed full of stuff, which she said I could take home in my car, which I told her probably I'd need about 10 40-foot truckloads to actually put it in. It's still in the shed, but I'm trying to slowly document it. One of the key things that once I started this process, I started looking at gathering as much information. I was so far down that road that I realized I hadn't actually stopped to think, what am I actually trying to do here? What is the policy underpinning this archive? What is the framework that I'm trying to create? What are the stories I'm trying to tell? And how do I want to do this? Again, Amanda pointed something out very kindly to me last night about that actually archiving should also include the exhibition and sharing of these histories. And this was something that I set out to do. I started exhibiting, I started doing talks, and tried to disseminate this information as much as I possibly could, but as one person and an individual, it's not always easy to do that. And also, ensuring that all aspects of our history were included was difficult, including the difficult ones, the dissenting voices, all of the problem issues that may have occurred, trying to put them in a framework that actually worked within the archive, but also was respectful to those stories, was difficult because this is not somewhere that I come from. Not all of the stories also were not ready to be told. People were happy to give them to you, but with certain caveats that you can use this in a general way, but not name me, not take it. I was explaining to somebody, or to Sharon actually earlier, that actually one individual had given me the first ever passport issued in Ireland with a change of gender marker in 1992. They told me I could speak about it, they told me I could mention their name, but they told me I couldn't physically, even though they donated the passport, I couldn't physically use the passport within my talks or within my exhibitions or in any shape or form, which kind of seemed a little bit weird, but because, you know, I said, look, I'll remove your picture, your name, your date of birth, etc. No, still don't want to do it. But you have to have had some sort of respect about showing that individuals who are giving you their stories and their issues, or their collections, that you are going to respect them. And also consideration when I was trying to design it was to try to be given to the untold, the unseen or emerging identities, stories. For example, over the last 20 years, we've had quite an influx of both South American and Eastern European sex workers, trans sex workers. Their stories are not told anywhere within our histories. Nobody is talking to them whatsoever in order to try and gather those histories. So trying to establish some sort of link there and see could I document some of that was also very difficult. Sorry, I've lost my area of where I was talking here. And also then exploring trans history is fraught with problems, because even the word trans in a historic context is not relevant. And you are looking for language that is very sometimes derogatory, seen as derogatory right now, and you're looking for language of gender variance. And in doing that work in the very early days, I made a very clear decision that I was not looking for, and I've considered changing the name of the archive, because the word trans is very specific sometimes now. But the work that I do is including gender variance rather than trans histories, because it's very difficult to try and ascertain now, 100 years later or 150 years later, whether somebody could be identified as trans at that point, because the language didn't exist. You also have such examples of, for instance, women who presented as men to join the Union Army in the American Civil War, but then returning to their homes and their gender identity after the war. You have situations like Dr. James Barry, who's kind of a controversial conversation. Is it a woman who's presented as a man for advancement educational reasons, or is it somebody who has clear gender variance? Dr. Barry wanted to be remembered as a man. Let's be very clear with that piece. So even if you don't want to use that language, we have to understand that the respect to individuals in history should be given to what we know from them. So all of these questions were going on in my head at the same time as trying to create an archive. So one of the things I set out to do just before COVID was to try and design a mission statement for the archive, which would underpin the work that I was doing and would take a broad and inclusive view of what it means to be trans or gender variant. The archive needed to be inclusive of all identities, and we would need to focus on the language of gender variance rather than the word trans or transgender or transsexual or sex change or all of this language that we have right now. And whether or not these individuals were trans or not, that I mentioned a moment ago, that they clearly transgressed the gender binary. And as with nearly all trans activism, it tends to be centered in a feminist framework, and therefore I needed to make sure I considered that within the work that I was doing. And therefore a mission to center all of the work in some sort of intersectional methodology or in a feminist framework was what I've been trying to do. Still struggling to do it. It's still a work that's ongoing. In fact, right now I still haven't got a mission statement finished. Myself and a friend of mine have tried to attempt to write it about 10 times at this point. However, the key to the archive was to increase awareness for me, increase visibility, and correct the absence of our histories in the official records. Even in the Irish LGBT records, the Irish Queer Archive, trans people are few and far between, and yet we know that organisations existed as far as back as the 1960s and individuals even further back. But as what's been questioned, can you keep an eye on the time here? Because I meant to press my phone, but I left it over there. But then, as some of you have said earlier today, like, what is an archive really? And I don't mean to offend by this, but it's really a box or a collection of boxes, folders, ephemera, hard drives, but most of all, memories. And that's what's key for me. Everyone has an archive of some sort or another. And this is where I admire most of you here who spend your lives taking care of these histories, these memories, maintaining them, digitizing them, ensuring they're available to be shared into the future for idiot researchers like me. But what does it take to sustain a community archive? It takes time, space, and money, all in short supply in my case. But it also requires knowledge and expertise which I frankly don't have. The biggest barrier is time to focus, time to catalogue, time to digitize. I won't go into all the things that I'm involved in. And as I said to Robbie outside, this is about the 5th thing in my list of importances. Probably 6th if I include my family beforehand, but they tend to end up being 6th rather than 1st sometimes. Currently, the archive consists of 87 boxes, 47,000 physical photographs, 3,700 audio and visual files. I was going to check how many digitized files so far, but I didn't get around to doing it. All sitting in my back hall, slowly creeping into my bedroom. So where does the time come? It's very difficult to find it. I have also spent my own hard-earned cash to create the archive that is there. The only funding we've ever received is the first exhibition that we presented in 2016, and that was €1,000. And yet, in the past 8 years, I've held 6 exhibitions, given 55 history talks, 6 keynote speeches, and written 14 articles, all on Irish trans history. And these have been given to a diverse range of organisations, from the National Library to the National Museum, universities, university LGBTQI societies, other LGBT organisations or research groups, LGBT community groups, most importantly, trans groups, because these histories need to be shared. Every time I do it, somebody comes up and goes, how did I not know about this? This needs to be out there. We need to know more about these histories. The problem is that when you've got one person trying to do it, there's a limit, as I say, time and space and resource. However, the big problem that really has hit of sustaining the archive was COVID, and not for the reason you might think. I've always known that to sustain the archive, I'd need to digitize it, and so I set out during COVID to do that. I set out to try and get as much digital material as possible, to try and scan as much as I could, and then try and catalogue also it both in the boxes and the digital version. However, it also has to be indexed, create metadata. I don't even know if that's the right words. But again, it takes time. The COVID pandemic created an interesting dilemma for me. I had lots of free time, spare money, and nowhere to go. Research became the game every day. I was looking forward to it. Every morning I would get up and onto the internet. What interesting stories could I find today? And I found them. Irish trans people travelling the globe. I wrote to one woman who had actually left Ireland when she was 10 back in the 1960s and have since struck up a correspondence with her at like pen pals again. She won't correspond through email, it's all by post, which is great. I heard about a lonely man called Frank who met a trans woman in 1972 in New York but had been warned off by the barman in the New York bar not to get involved in, and wondered whatever happened to her. And I found this letter in a magazine, an American magazine. So I'd researched all of these stories across the globe. And what I realized was, I'm not an archivist. I don't want to be an archivist. I have the honor of holding these documents and papers and stories. But in reality, what I want to do is tell the stories and provide the information out there. I don't want to have to hold that archive. So where to now? Where are we and where are we going to go next? I'm currently convinced that what's best for my archive at the moment is that it needs to be a living archive. It needs to be shared, it needs to be accessible. It needs to provide the visual and oral history of our community as much as it is a library or an archive. The work of collating, archiving, cataloguing, yes, is necessary for the future, but currently it's secondary to its survival. And this is not in mind, but I was talking to Robbie outside a moment ago, and Robbie said, I don't know where to find any of this information. Where is our history, or what was it like to be trans prior to you coming out? And that is where the problem is that these stories are not out there, they're not available, they're sitting in my back hall in boxes, and only when I get an opportunity to go out and talk about them that they can be done, where we need an army of individuals to be able to share these stories. So personally, I want to ensure that our younger generation know that they have a history, that others have walked this path before them, that Dr. Lydia Foy spent 22 years fighting legal cases against the Irish government in order for their right to be recognised, and how that history has made their lives easier to navigate despite the current backlashes that are going on. So the short-term future to create more exhibitions, provide more oral histories and produce more publications of the stories that we have yet to hear in public is what my aim is. And again, as I said, this creates a challenge, my own personal challenge, a challenge to find a space to let go of the archive, to let go of my books, my letters, my t-shirts, my badges, because they are also central to what's in the archive. I need to find someone or somewhere that I can trust to care for it. You've all mentioned this morning about, I think it was Julia actually was talking about where organizations or institutions don't have resources to take in these archives, and sometimes they're discarded. And therefore they're not cared for and loved as they need to be. Deciding what part of the archive is mine and I'm not willing to let go is also difficult. And also what should go is difficult. But one of the other key pieces for me is this issue about where it goes. We had an example of this within the National Library in Ireland with the Irish Queer Archive. Currently, the Irish Queer Archive is sitting with the National Library. It was donated, I think, roughly about 8-9 years ago. Only 10% of it is available right now. 90% of it is sitting in boxes in a warehouse on the north side of Dublin, and nobody can get hold of it. We're lucky in the trans community that very little of our history is in that archive anyway, but it still should be interesting for us to be able to research why we're not in there. Why have we not had, we were not part of that community during the previous 40 or 50 years, but that's not accessible to us right now. So I'm very conscious that when I choose to let the archive go or to put it somewhere that it will be taken care of, that it has to go to the right place and that somebody has the resource to take it on and that we can actually access the information. So for me, at the moment, I still think I'm not an archivist. I don't think anyone will ever convince me. But I will continue to research and collect and record and store what I can for the time being. I will engage with those of us who are interested in archives in the future and try to identify a home. I will continue to tell these stories and share them as widely as possible. But, as I say, somebody needs to take the archive from my home.